So we've covered long-run aggregate supply in previous videos as this long-run trend growth determined by the Solow model, say about 1.5% of the United States. But what we have here is there is no relationship then between the output gap and the inflation gap in this long run. But in the short run, we do observe a certain relationship between that output gap and the inflation gap from the perspective of firms. And let's cover that very quickly and see what that has to say about our Keynesian model. So, the short-run aggregate supply curve is determined by inflation expectations within an economy. Now, this mainly comes from what is called in the literature sticky prices, or this lag in price changes as real output grows or falls. So this creates a kind of upward sloping relationship between inflation and real output in the short run. So we have this inflation gap changing as the output gap grows within a short run time period. Again, in the long run, expected inflation is, the targeted inflation gap, so there should be no relationship. But in the short run, we could have shocks to that inflation, and we could have firms responding to that kind of shock. So suppose we expect inflation, for example, to be at this orange bar right here at the intersection of say, that long run and short run aggregate demand curve, aggregate supply curve. If the output gap ends up being in an area somewhere above that orange bar, firms are expecting lower prices. They're expecting prices around here, but they got higher growth in prices. So they'll produce more to take advantage of what's going on here, that price bump in the short run. But if the output gap is in an area that with a lower inflation, then firms are expecting higher prices, but they ended up with lower prices, leading to lower revenue, and so they'll produce less in order to cut costs. So remember, we're taking this from the firm perspective of supply and output, not the consumer perspective, which we'll go into with the aggregate demand curve. Now, in a special case here, notice I've drawn the line as horizontal or perfectly flat. This indicates what's called a liquidity trap. And so for the US, this would be the point at which nominal rates are zero. Any attempted increase in the output gap does not lead to a corresponding increase in that inflation gap. And this is generally a bad spot for policymakers to be in. You can consider the US in the wake of the Great Recession, and Japan actually since its stagnation in the 90s and into the aughts and teens. So in this case, traditional monetary policy by the Fed really wouldn't work out very well because that's going to be based on an aggregate demand curve, where this we'd end up moving this gray line here, which we'll get into in the next few videos. Now, we can shift, or this curve can be shifted by these inflation shocks, something that fundamentally changes our inflation expectations here. If we are expecting higher than normal inflation, then this curve rises and there's higher inflation expectations along every potential output gap along that short run supply curve. Now, this could be an example, say the OPEC oil price shocks in the 1970s, a much higher growth in the increases in gas and oil prices than people were expecting, and then firms respond to that in what they supply and what they provide. We could also have, and this is more of a more ambiguous point, an interesting one, we could also have the sort of lower inflation expectations along all points. And I would argue that in this case we could talk about the incorporation of computers and technology in the 1990s and 2000s, where we end up with lower than expected inflation. So if inflation expectations fall, there's a lower inflation along every potential output gap on the SRAS curve here, on the short run aggregate supply curve. So this is not very well controlled because we're having to delve deep into the psychology of people and what they expect in terms of inflation. The Fed has attempted to kind of stabilize this curve through what it calls forward guidance. It tries to make as much of its policy transparent and accountable and credible as possible so that people don't shift their inflation expectations. But of course, this is extremely difficult to do. And you could, of course, mess it up. If you lose credibility, then of course people will change their inflation expectations. That's why credibility is so important to the Federal Reserve. Taxing and spending cuts, as far as the U.S. system goes, you can see far in advance when there's going to be a tax cut or when there's going to be a spending increase. So I don't think this really shifts any inflation expectations. It would have to be an unexpected shock somewhere along the federal government line in terms of taxing and spending, which I just don't think is Well, I mean, it's probable, but I think it's very improbable given how easy it is to see all the bills coming down the pipeline in Congress towards the Senate and then finally for approval by the president. So this may move according to certain shocks. But really, where monetary policy control comes in is going to have to be from the demand side and this aggregate demand curve. So we've set up this situation in the long run and the short run for firms and what they will produce and what inflation growth they expect. Now we will take a look at the consumer side of things that drives our economy and our monetary and fiscal policy.